This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and this is my Spider-Man and Through the Omenpaths Archetype Guide. I've already evaluated every single card in both sets, and in this video I'm going to break down the synergies for each of the two color archetypes in them. Because this set is different in terms of card names and art in paper, where it's known as Spider-Man, and on Arena, where it's known as Through the Omenpaths, I'm going to be including images of both versions of each card in this video. The top row you'll see as I discuss these archetypes will be the Spider-Man version, and the bottom row is the Through the Omenpaths version. When discussing these cards, I'll be using the Spider-Man name since those are the cards people will see at the pre-release. This video focuses on what each of the supported color pairs wants to do in the format, and that means I'm generally not going to just mention cards that are really good in every kind of deck, like premium removal and bombs, unless they have some specific synergy within a color pair. Instead, the focus here is only on cards that support what each color pair is doing. If you want to know my thoughts on what's good in this set more broadly, check out my set review, or if you want to know what the most powerful cards in this set are period, check out my video on the top 10 bombs. For now though, let's get started with my archetype guide for Spider-Man and Through the Omenpaths. So let's look at blue-black first. This format is a bit different than your typical one in that there are not 10 heavily supported archetypes, there are only 5. Each of the enemy color pairs has an archetype. This set is smaller than most, but they still managed to fit in 4 signpost cards for each color pair. These are cards that are in exactly those 2 colors that have an effect related to what that color pair's main synergy is. That's why we call them signpost cards. For example, blue-black is a color pair that is both about the connive mechanic and villains. It might sound like those are 2 different things, but they really aren't, because every card in the set that's a creature that connives is a villain. So these are things that work well together, and Prowler Clawed Thief is probably the best example of this, because whenever another villain you control enters, Prowler connives. So he connives off of villains, fitting perfectly here, and any deck that can connive a lot is going to be good with the graveyard and good at growing creatures, because connive lets you loot and then you discard a card. If it's a non-land, you put a +1/+1 counter on the creature that connives. Prowler also has menace, so it feels pretty good to grow him. Meanwhile, Morbius the Living Vampire does not say anything about connive, but it is a villain, and it does something out of the graveyard, so it's not a terrible thing to discard when you connive, because once he's in the graveyard, you can pay 2 and exile Morbius to look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them in the hand, and the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. Meanwhile, Vulture, Scheming Scavenger, is all into villains. It's not about connive or the graveyard. When it attacks, your other villains gain flying until end of turn. And then lastly, there's a common in Mob Lookout, which is a 2-mana 0/3, and when it enters, target creature you control connives. So what are the villain payoffs? In addition to Prowler and Vulture, we have Doc Ock Sinister Scientist, who has hexproof as long as you control another villain, Flying Octobot, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another villain you control enters, but only triggers once a turn. That one looks like a truly premium villain payoff to me because it's so easy to grow in a set where like a third of the creatures are villains, especially in blue-black. And if you can get this down early and just play villains on turn 3 and 4, you're already really going wild with this card, so it's a pretty exciting one. The Spot's Portal is a removal spell that gets better if you control a villain. Tombstone likes the graveyard and villains, because when it enters you return a villain from your graveyard, and it makes your villains cheaper. And there's also Venom's Hunger, another removal spell. This one gets cheaper if you control a villain. There are also graveyard payoffs in this color pair that work well with the connive part. Doc Ock, in addition to being a villain payoff, is also a graveyard payoff because if you have 8 or more cards in your graveyard, he becomes an 8/8. We've already looked at Morbius. Alien Symbiosis is an aura, and you can choose to discard a card in your hand to cast it from your graveyard. So if you discard Symbiosis to connive, you're going to get a counter, and you're not going to lose it forever. Beetle, Legacy Criminal, and Venom are both passable creatures that then have abilities they can use from the graveyard that put counters on things and give them a keyword until end of turn. That means they're pretty good to discard to connive, and we've already seen Tombstone. Rares that work well here include another incarnation of Dr. Octopus. This one gives all of your villains +2/+2. He also draws you a ton of cards. There's also Mysterio, Master of Illusion, who makes a 3/3 blue illusion villain creature token for each non-token villain you control when it enters. There's Behold the Sinister 6, which isn't explicitly a villain payoff, but it is a nice graveyard payoff. If you're conniving all game long and you know you have Behold the Sinister 6 in your deck, you can feel a lot better about discarding things and getting counters. There's Norman Osborn, an unblockable villain that connives anytime you deal combat damage to a player. You can also transform it, at which point he gives all the cards in your graveyard Mayhem, and Mayhem is a mechanic that works nicely with connive in general because it lets you cast a card from your graveyard if you discarded it that turn. Speaking of Mayhem, there's also a land that has it in Oscorp Industries. There's also Superior Spider-Man, who enters as a copy of any creature card in a graveyard, except it's a 4/4 with the same name. So again, if you're discarding things for connive, you're going to be able to use them quite well. And there's also Symbiote Spider-Man, who has a combat damage trigger that draws you a card and puts a card in the graveyard, and has an ability that can be used from the graveyard that gives a creature a counter and this ability. So that's blue-black. It's both about a creature type, villain, and a mechanic, connive, and those two things work pretty well together. Green-white is similar. It is also about a mechanic, but also about a creature type. In this case, the mechanic is web slinging, a mechanic that only appears on spiders, and obviously the creature type that's supported here is spiders. So you've got Spider-Man India as one of the Signpost uncommons. It has web slinging, which is an alternate casting cost you can gain access to if you return a tapped creature from the battlefield to your hand. So it's a mechanic that lets you get these spiders down earlier in most cases, but it also gives you ways to rebuy enters, triggers, and get various other forms of value out of it. For example, Spider-Man India also has a trigger that anytime you cast a creature, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control and it gains flying until end of turn. So if you use web slinging, you have a creature returned to your hand, and maybe that turn or perhaps next turn, you're going to be able to get that trigger. Spider-Girl Legacy Hero doesn't have web slinging, but she's a great enabler for them because when she leaves the battlefield, and note there are a lot of cards in this set that say that because they're meant to work with web slinging. If they say that, that means you're going to get their effect when they die still, but also when you bounce it to your hand or any other way it leaves the battlefield. And in her case, she makes a 1/1 green and white human citizen creature token. And then you have two hybrid mana cards in green-white, both of which are really good for returning to your hand as well. You've got Web Warriors, who puts a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control when it enters, which also goes well with green-white's usual predilection for going wide. And there's also Gallant Citizen, a 2-mana 1/1 that draws you a card when it enters. The web slinging mechanic does create sort of an interesting dynamic where if you're attacking with Gallant Citizen, like your opponent has to think about whether or not you're just trying to set up web slinging, or if like you have a trick that can allow Gallant Citizen to bust right through their creature, and that's going to be sort of an interesting dynamic in this set. I've included a few web slinging payoffs. They are not the only ones at all, but they are some of the interesting ones for this color pair in terms of helping you get web slinging going and paying you off for doing it. So City Pigeon and Damage Control Crew are both cards, like Spider-Girl Legacy Hero, that are good at giving you value when you return them to your hand. City Pigeon has one of those leaves the battlefield triggers. It gives you a food token. Damage Control Crew, when it enters, either lets you exile an artifact or enchantment or return a card with mana value 4 or greater from your graveyard to your hand. So recasting those is good. Flash Thompson also has an interest trigger, but he also gives you one of several ways in this set to tap your creatures without having to attack with them, because sometimes that's ideal. You know, you can't get in with your Damage Control Crew. Your opponent can just kill it if they block it. But Flash gives you a way to tap that creature, and he can, of course, also untap creatures. He also makes it easier for your creatures to get in, so you can use web slinging. Flash Thompson just does a lot of good stuff for this deck. There's also Spider UK, who is a card with web slinging, but he also likes it if 2 or more creatures enter the battlefield under your control this turn, in which case he draws you a card and gains you 2 life. It's going to be easier for you to put 2 creatures into play in a turn in a world where you're web slinging, because, for example, you attack with your City Pigeon and then you put Spider UK into play with web slinging, then you have 1 mana left over, so you replay City Pigeon. There you go, you have that trigger. There's also stuff like Supported Parents, which lets you tap creatures for mana, and obviously in addition to that, it helps you set up things like web slinging, and there are lots of other ways to do it in the set too. These are just some of the most notable ones, I think. So that is the web slinging angle, but there's also a spider angle here, and some of them kind of overlap with the whole idea of web slinging, some of them don't. Aunt May is an example of where it does, because anytime a creature enters, you gain a life, so she likes it if you're bouncing creatures to your hand, then replaying them. But if it happens to be a spider, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Ezekiel Sims' Spider Totem at the beginning of combat gives +2/+2 to a spider you control until end of turn. I suppose that can help you maybe get in with a spider that couldn't attack before, and then you could web sling it back, but that one does mostly feel like a spider payoff. As does Grow Extra Arms, which is a 1 mana +4/+4 spell if it targets a spider. There's also Thwip, which gives +2/+2 and flying to a creature until end of turn, and you gain 2 life if it's a spider. These are 2 cards that I suppose can also help you set up web slinging to an extent, because they allow a creature to survive and win combat. I have Spider Mobile here, so any vehicle in this set is going to work interestingly with web slinging. Problem is, most of the vehicles in this set don't look very good to me, and neither does Spider Mobile, but obviously this is the deck for it, because crewing lets you tap a creature, and not only that, but Spider Mobile is a spider payoff, because when it attacks or blocks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each spider you control. There's also Guy in the Chair, 3 mana 2/3 that can tap for mana of any color. And you can also pay 2 generic and a green and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on a spider, activate only as a sorcery. That can also potentially set up web slinging. And then there's Wall Crawl, which is all in on buffing your spiders. When it enters, it creates a 2/1 green spider creature token with reach, gains you a life for each spider you control, and gives all of your spiders +1/+1 and makes them unblockable by creatures with Defender. So yeah, green-white likes spiders, and it likes web slinging, just like blue-black likes connive and villains. These things are all interconnected because the mechanic only appears on creatures of that specific type. Rares that fit in here include Radioactive Spider, who is not only, obviously enough, a spider, but can also be sacrificed to tutor up a spider hero, which is what most of the cards with web slinging are. There's Mary Jane Watson, who draws you a card when a spider enters. There's Silk Webweaver, who has web slinging, and she's also one of these cards that gives you a payoff for casting creature spells. She makes a 1/1 when you do. She can also buff your whole board, so she helps you go wide and then can buff everything. There's Arachne Psionic Weaver, another card with web slinging. This one has one of the cheapest web slinging costs too, making it more likely that you can kind of go off with it in terms of returning something for value. And then she also has this ability that lets you choose a card type and tax your opponent when they try to play that card. There's Origin of Spider-Man, which not only gives you a spider token, but its Chapter 2 can allow you to put a counter on something and make something into a spider that wasn't one already. There's Spider-Ham Peter Porker, who when it enters makes a food token, so already that makes it a potentially good card to return for web slinging. But he also buffs a bunch of creature types, a bunch of animal ones, including your spiders. And there's also Peter Parker, who has an enters trigger that makes a spider, making it an ideal card to return with web slinging. And once it transforms into its other side, or if you cast it that way because it's a modal double face card, it also gives all of your legendary creatures web slinging. So he's kind of a payoff and an enabler depending on how things go. So that's green-white. It's about the spider type and the web slinging mechanic. Let's move now to black-red, which is all about a specific mechanic that is good when you discard. And that mechanic is Mayhem, which you can see on Scarlet Spider Kane here. If you discard a card with Mayhem, for the rest of your turn, you can cast it from the graveyard for that Mayhem cost. Now, it is important to note, as the reminder text tells you, this is not Madness. With Madness, you can violate the rules about timing because it's a separate effect from you casting the card when you do something with Madness. But with this, it isn't. It goes to your graveyard, it has to be in your graveyard, and then you can only cast it how you normally could. So, for example, Scarlet Spider Kane can only be cast at sorcery speed, so don't discard it during your opponent's turn and hope you can put it into play. Basically, it's like Flashback and Madness had a baby. That's basically what the Mayhem mechanic is. And Scarlet Spider has a really cheap Mayhem cost of only 1 black-red hybrid mana, and when it enters, you can discard a card, and if you do, you put a counter on him. So he's got Mayhem. He can also help you trigger things with Mayhem. Your other signpost uncommon is Green Goblin Revenant, who when it attacks has you discard, so again, a way to cast something with Mayhem, and then you draw a card for each card you've discarded this turn, so you're likely to have other ways to discard in this deck too, so drawing multiple cards with him certainly isn't out of the question. There's also Shriek Troublemaker, who gives you a way to discard a card at the beginning of your first main phase, and when you do, it makes target creature unable to block this turn. So again, way to activate Mayhem while also being aggressive. It also pings your opponent anytime one of their creatures dies. And then there's Pumpkin Bombardment, which is another enabler because as an additional cost to cast it, you can either pay 2 generic or discard a card. And if you're making it into a way better removal spell by paying 1 and then casting something with Mayhem that you discard, it's pretty gross. Other cards with Mayhem include Electro's Bolt, a removal spell that gets cheaper when you discard it, Prison Break, a reanimation spell that gets cheaper when you discard it, and Raging Goblinoids, which is a 5-mana 5/4 haste normally that becomes a 3-mana 5/4 haste if you discard it at that turn. Sandman's Quicksand is actually more expensive with Mayhem, but it becomes a way better card because it's a symmetrical -2/-2 if you cast it normally, but if you cast it with Mayhem, it only hits your opponent's stuff. Spider Islanders is another creature that becomes cheaper when you cast it with Mayhem. And then there's Swarm Being of Bees, which is pretty interesting because it has Flash, and that means, in its case, if you do discard it during your opponent's turn, you can still cast it for the Mayhem cost, because you can cast it at instant speed, and the Mayhem cost there is 1 mana, which is pretty good for a 2/2 with Flash and Flying. So let's look at some other payoffs for discarding in addition to Mayhem, as well as some of the ways that you can discard in the first place. So Hobgoblin Mantled Marauder gets +2/+0 until end of turn anytime you discard a card, which this deck obviously wants to do. Inner Demon Gangsters gives you a free discard effect. It's a sorcery speed one that gives it +1/+0 and menace until end of turn. Masked Meower can give itself up and allow you to discard a card and draw a card. Spider Gwen Free Spirit discards a card and you draw a card when you tap it. Romantic Rendezvous has you discard a card to draw 2 cards. And we've already seen Alien Symbiosis. Rares that work well here, well, obviously, you've got Carnage Crimson Chaos, a creature with Mayhem, and it also likes it when you have stuff in your graveyard because it can reanimate a small creature. And yeah, the Mayhem cost there is 2. There's Oscorp Industries, a land with Mayhem. Ultimate Green Goblin is a creature with Mayhem that also is a way to trigger Mayhem because at the beginning of your upkeep, you can discard a card. Actually, you have to discard a card, and it gives you a treasure token. The Death of Gwen Stacy is a good removal spell saga, and Chapter 2 gives you a way to trigger Mayhem. Shadow of the Goblin, I think, probably isn't very good. It's way too all-in on doing Mayhem stuff. I mean, as we just saw, sure, Mayhem is in the set, but it's not like it's going to be on every card in your deck in Limited, and it basically doesn't do much if you don't have anything with Mayhem. If you do, it gives you a free way to discard a card and draw a card and trigger things, but unlike the other cards we've seen that do stuff like that, they are like removal spells and creatures that do something else. Shadow of the Goblin pretty much doesn't. Now, it does ping your opponent anytime you do the Mayhem thing. Also, if you exile a card and then cast it that turn, you know, like red often gets those effects, that'll ping them too. But it doesn't add to the board, and it really only turns into like a crazy engine if somehow you have like 10 cards with Mayhem in your deck, which is very unlikely. There's also Rocket-Powered Goblin Glider, an equipment that if you cast it for its Mayhem, attaches for free to something, and that's pretty good because it gives +2/+0 flying and haste. So that's black-red. It's about the Mayhem mechanic and discarding cards and getting value out of it. Let's move to red-green now, which is all about things that cost 4 or more mana. You've got Craven Proud Predator, which just likes high mana value as among your permanents in general because its power is equal to that greatest mana value. You've got Rhino Barreling Brute, who when it attacks, checks to see if you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, and if you did, you draw a card. Counts himself, and because he has Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, he's likely to draw you a card the turn you play him. Rhino's Rampage doesn't actually say anything on it about high mana value cards, but it is a fight spell that gets a lot better in a deck that has big creatures that cost 4 or more mana. And then there's Spider Manifestation, which is a really good common 2-mana 2/2 with reach that can tap for red or green, so it helps you get to higher mana value things quicker. And it's also a payoff for them because it untaps when you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater. Other payoffs for doing stuff with mana value 4 or greater, you've got Angry Rabble, which pings the opponent anytime you do that. It also is a mana sink to use all your mana on, which you're likely to have a decent amount of because you're in a high mana value deck. There's Damage Control Crew, who has a mode that lets you return a card with mana value 4 or greater from your graveyard to your hand. Notably, it's any card with mana value 4 or greater in this case, so you can actually get back a removal spell or something. There's also Lurking Lizards, a 2-mana 1/3 trampler that gets a counter every time you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater. Maybe it'll be this set's Sahagin. There's also Superior Foes of Spider-Man, a 3-mana 3/3 trampler that allows you, anytime you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, to exile the top card of your library, and you can play that card until you exile another card with Superior Foes of Spider-Man. And then there's Terrific Team Up, a good removal spell that becomes excellent in this deck because if you control a permanent with mana value 4 or greater, it only costs 2 mana. Rares that line up nicely here, there's really only 2 of them. There's Scarlet Spider Ben Riley, who has Web Slinging, and if you cast it the Web Slinging way, he enters with X +1/+1 counters on him, where X is the mana value of the returned creature. And then there's Doc Ock's Tentacles, which actually checks for mana value 5 or greater, but anytime a creature with that high of a mana value enters, Doc Ock's Tentacles automatically attaches to it. And our last color pair is Blue-White, which is about Modified. So we can see the Modified mechanic on Spider, piloted by Penny. 5 mana 4/4 with Vigilance that puts a counter on a creature when it enters. And whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. And it says equipment, auras you control, and counters or modifications. So in other words, if you put a counter on a creature, if you equip a creature, or if you've put an aura on one of your creatures, basically you've made them better in one of these ways, it's considered modified. And that means Spider entering sets up a modification because you put a counter on something. Oftentimes you'll be able to cast this and draw a card in the same turn. It's kind of like Halia in the last set in that sense. And then it can draw you even more cards. Wraith, Vicious Vigilante, doesn't say anything on it about modifications, but it's like the ideal thing to modify because it's a 3-mana 1/1 a double strike that can't be blocked. Even just putting one counter on it is nuts. And the combo of Wraith plus Spider, which is definitely something you're going to see, they're both uncommons in the same color pair, is pretty gross because if it hits your opponent twice when it has a counter on it, you draw 2 cards. So that's going to be a thing. Skyward Spider is a 2-mana 2/2 with Ward 2 that gains flying when it's modified. And Sun Spider Nimble Webber helps you search up modifications because it lets you grab an aura or equipment from your deck, put it into your hand, and then shuffle when it enters. It also has flying, so on your turn anyway, so it's a good thing to modify too. There are not a lot of modified payoffs beyond this. I mean, the good news is the set has lots of ways to modify your creatures. You know, Connive can set it up with the +1/+1 counter, for example, and lots of ways to put counters on things. But in terms of cards that actually say the words modified on them, all we've got is Spider, piloted by Penny, and Skyward Spider, and then 2 more cards, those being Costume Closet, an artifact that enters with 2 counters on it. When you tap it, you can move a counter from it to another creature you control, activate only as a sorcery. And when a modified creature you control leaves the battlefield, you put a counter on the closet. So it can accumulate a lot of counters and make sure you always have something that's modified. And Silver Sable Mercenary Leader also has an enters trigger that puts a counter on something. And when she attacks, target modified creature you control gains lifelink. I also have Selfless Police Captain here. He doesn't explicitly say anything about modifications, but he's a good place to stockpile counters because when it leaves the battlefield, you put those counters on target creature you control. And there are also just 2 rares for this color pair. One of them is Bioorganic Carapace, which is a really strong equipment. When it enters, it attaches to something, which means you have a modified creature, and that's important because it gives the equipped creature +2/+2, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card for each modified creature you control. And there's also With Great Power, a card I don't really believe in the format, mostly just because this kind of effect doesn't play super well in Limited, where you really risk 2-for-1ing yourself to a removal spell, and like damage prevention is kind of weird, but it does give +2/+2 for each aura and equipment attached to it. So if you're going hard with those types of modifications, it does get better. So that's it. Those are the 5 supported color pairs in Spider-Man and through the Omenpaths. It's going to be interesting to see how this format goes. The whole pick 2 thing may mean that it's actually easier to sort of announce what your lane is in draft, and you can end up with more synergistic two-color decks because you can pick up more cards early that fit into the strategy that appears to be the most open. But the fact that the set also is smaller than usual probably means that these 5 color pairs will probably get kind of stale kind of quickly because you're going to be seeing them all the time, and the set being small means you're going to see them even more than you normally would in a set that has 5 color pairs as the archetypes. But we'll see. I imagine it's at least going to be fun for a few weeks to play this format. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including all my other videos about this new limited format, including my set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.